It's just gonna be a little, I guess, rant. Um, I'm gonna touch on this whole Russia, Ukraine, NATO thing. Um, just give you my feelings on it, my perspective. I think it's a little different than what people are hearing. Um, to me, it's very interesting that people are so upset with the Ukraine invading Russia, given that the United States has been so involved in, I don't know if you would call them invasions. Like Shakespeare said, what's in a word would rose by any other name smell any less sweet. So if you weren't to call it an invasion, if you were to call it bringing freedom to somewhere. But the United States obviously has been in Afghanistan, Iraq, other places. More specifically, what I think, from a perspective, as far as the perspective that I have on it, is that the United States was kind of built and predicated on um, whether you would call it annexing, invading, conquering, geopolitical reasons. It was known as manifest destiny when the United States had begun its initial stage of expansion. Obviously, primarily starting out with 13 colonies and then westward expansion. The United States purchased land, famously from France, the Louisiana Purchase. Quote unquote settlers, quote unquote, settled the Western United States, which was full of Native American tribes, cultures, civilizations that are by and large no longer there, or they're forced to reside on or around reservations. When we look at Texas, the quote unquote Spanish American War, where the result of that was the United States obtaining a lot of the southwestern United States, a lot of the southwestern regions of the United States, namely Texas. At one point in time, I'm sure the Mexicans and the Native Americans in Texas did not want to be a part of the United States. They probably wanted their independence. If you watch Western movies, you see quote unquote lawmen and quote unquote cowboys fighting Mexican rebels, Native Americans. So the United States did exactly what Russia is doing to the Ukraine for 250, 300 years. It was called Manifest Destiny. Britain, the United Kingdom, did what Russia is doing to the Ukraine to the whole world for nearly 1,000 years. And that's why the saying, or that's where the saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire comes from. So, when I look at just my perspective on these things, and I reflect upon some of the things I've read, Noam Chomsky, namely Necessary Illusions. And I'm not going to get too much into in this video Russia's the Cold War or the interplay between the United States. I'm going to do a separate video on that because I think it's very worth a separate video on in itself, because Russia and the United States' dynamic over the past 60 years is worthy of study. But the United States has invaded, conquered its way to being, 50 states. Um, the Oregon Trail. Our settlers, our frontiersmen, pioneering, subduing the West, Yeah, all of those areas were inhabited by people, by civilizations, by nations, even. So the United States was built on exactly what Russia is doing now. Furthermore, the United States was built by men very much like Vladimir Putin. You know, white men who wanted to conquer things, who wanted to take things over, and didn't care much about people's opinions or democracy. Um, and I think the key part to all of this and how people perceive what's being done, the difference between a revolutionary and a terrorist, is the media. And I don't just mean, mainstream media, television media, or even print media, which is going extinct. But um, I mean the textbooks that we have in school. I mean the comic books, the Marvel comic books that tend to create certain images for heroes and tend to create certain images for villains. Personally, I don't believe in the use of violence unless it's absolutely necessary for the survival of an organism. I don't believe in using violence to spread one's ideas. I don't believe in using violence to acquire property or assets, even though this country was specifically built on the use of violence for the acquisition of assets and resources. I don't believe in that. And I don't believe there should be any exception to that. There's no exception to that rule in my life. I don't believe in the use of firearms. However, that's very interesting. Like when you look at a conflict like what's going on, who wins? I mean, essentially everybody loses. Russia loses. The Ukraine loses. Russia loses because they're in the wrong. I'm sure they'll experience minimal casualties. The Ukraine loses because of property destruction, casualties. Who wins? The only people to win are people who manufacture armaments and similar, resources that are expended during times of war and conflict. So I guess this video is just to provide an objective perspective, an objective, overarching perspective of the situation, which is that, by and large, this wealthy, great, powerful nation was built on conquering stuff. It was built by white men who don't play fair. So now, I think that Western powers, Western spheres of influence, Western governments attempt to monopolize the legitimate use of violence as a means of political or ideological advancement. And they don't like when anybody else uses violence. The Cold War is partially responsible for the crack epidemic, the heroin epidemic, not just in the United States, but even in Mexico. If you watch Narcos, you'll see, Felix Gallardo, a lot of the initial founders of the Guadalajara cartel had ties with Mexican intelligence, which had ties with the CIA, and they were allowed to do what they were allowed to do because it helped to fund America's dirty wars. It's a quick video. Is there really a difference between the Ukraine now and Texas during the Spanish-American War?